Hello and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 67, Tuesday, November 30th, 2021.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I'm joined, as always, by my lovely co-host, Emily.
Hello, Courtney. Great to be back, but we're not alone.
Yes, we are pleased to welcome back a special guest to the podcast. He previously joined us on episode 44 for our summer cinema series, Live Action and Literary Classics, to discuss 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. It is my boyfriend, Dr. Douglas Kern. Doug is currently a professor of English at Valencia College, and he's joining us today with his knowledge of media and foundation of a PhD in theater, film, and television from the University of York. This episode was actually his idea after a trip to the Salvador Dalí Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida earlier this year. So welcome back, Doug.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me back. I'm looking forward to discussing what originally seemed to me an unlikely collaboration between Salvador Dalí, Walt Disney, and the Disney Corporation.
Yeah, this was such an interesting book. You both gave me this book after your trip for my birthday, and we've been waiting to do this now for a couple months, so I'm really excited to dive in. To give us a little bit of context, the book that we read was Disney and Dali, Architects of the Imagination, from the museum exhibit. So this actually comes from the Walt Disney Family Museum, which was an exhibit displayed from July 10th, 2015 to January 3rd, 2016, and was organized by the Walt Disney Family Museum in cooperation with the Dalí Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, and the Gala Salvador Dalí Foundation in Figueres, Spain, and the Walt Disney Studios. Here is the description from the museum's website. Guest curated by filmmaker Ted Nicolau, this extraordinary, immersive, and enriching experience tells the story of the unlikely alliance between two of the most renowned innovators of the 20th century, brilliantly eccentric Spanish surrealist Salvador Dalí and American entertainment innovator Walt Disney, presented through an interactive multimedia experience of original paintings, story sketches, conceptual artwork, objects, correspondences, archival film, photographs, and audio, many of which highlight work from Disney studio artists Mary Blair, Ivan Earle, John Hench, Kay Nielsen, and more. This comprehensive exhibition showcases two vastly different icons who were drawn to each other through the unique personalities, their mutual admiration, and their collaboration on the animated short Destino. Although the film was not completed during their lifetimes, the friendship between these two great men nevertheless endured. Born almost 3 years and half a world apart, Disney and Dali's boyhood imaginations were grounded in their upbringing in the 1900s, causing their lives, careers, and legacies to be paralleled on a level unlike any other. Though they may seem like opposites on the surface, a deeper look into the lives and artistic prominence of the surrealist and the dreamer, highlighted through handwritten letters alongside archival film and audio, will showcase just how alike these two innovators really were in blurring the lines between reality and dreams.
Thank you so much for that overview. I wish we had been able to see the exhibit in person, but we'll get to how we were able to revisit that through the text. But before we get there, I thought it would be best for Doug and I to ground you in just a little bio of Disney and Dali. Walt Disney is likely familiar to our listeners as fans of the Walt Disney Company, and we've covered his life story in depth in episode 9, where we read Bob Thomas's biography, Walt Disney, an American Original, and in episode 19, Meet the Disney Brothers, where we highlighted a children's book by interviewing the author, Aaron H. Goldberg. But to ground us in our current discussion, Walter Elias Disney was born December 5th, 1901 in Chicago. He had an early interest in drawing from a young age and channeled that interest into a career as an animator and illustrator, which later led to him establishing his own studio with his brother Roy O. Disney and emerging into a leadership role there. Walt and his talented animators like Ub Iwerks became pioneers of the animation medium with their hit characters of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit and, of course, Mickey Mouse. After finding success in short animated films, Disney and the studio cracked the feature film market in 1937 with the beloved Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And while this film was a major success, the studio sometimes struggled, especially during World War II and the studio's package film era. Never one to rest on his laurels, though, Disney was an innovator in both animation and live-action films and often combined the two mediums. He then turned his sights to theme parks to create and open Disneyland, and then began his efforts that led to Walt Disney World and his dream of Epcot prior to his passing in 1966.
Salvador Dali was born in Spain, and as Emily told us, was just 2.5 years after Walt Disney on May 11th, 1904. He lived one heck of a life and died in his country of birth on January 23rd, 1989. In his early years as an artist, Dalí shared a close friendship with filmmaker Luis Buñuel and poet and playwright Federico Garcia Lorca. While Dalí, his unmistakable mustache, and his paintings remain arguably the most famous iconic images of surrealism, his relationships with these masterful storytellers reveals Dalí's artistic ambitions as they spanned well beyond a painter's canvas. In fact, Dalí collaborated with Buñuel on Un Chien Andalou, a silent surrealist short film in 1929, which actually displays Dalí's fascination with the human eye and crawling ants, just to name a few of his recurring motifs. For his idiosyncrasies and antics, Dalí became a bit of a media darling in the United States. And as a result of his artistic vision and clear love of cinema as an ideal medium for surrealist art, Hollywood eventually came knocking. In the 1940s, for example, Alfred Hitchcock called upon Dalí to design the dream sequence for his 1945 film Spellbound, starring Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck. It was around this time that Dalí met Walt Disney and was asked to collaborate with him on an animated short that we'll be discussing today.
Excellent. So before we get to the animated short, we want to talk about these two men together. And it's really cool that this was something that we got to explore kind of after the fact as a book of a museum exhibit. So again, the book is Disney and Dali, Architects of the Imagination, and this is a compilation of the artifacts that were in the museum exhibit. So we don't get to really see the audio or the visuals that the description from the museum talked about as being supplementary, but we have a lot in here of letters, artwork, sketches, photographs. So there's a lot in here. This is a different kind of book for us, and so I wanted to ask, to get us started, do either of you usually buy books that commemorate museum exhibits?
This was the first time that I ever did, and it's interesting because it was in the Salvador Dali Museum gift shop, but that was not the current exhibition. We actually made a trip there with friend of the show, Leanne, to see a Van Gogh Alive exhibition that was being housed in the Dali Museum, but of course enjoyed taking in Dali's works that were on display there. But as we were browsing the gift shop, we saw this Disney and Dali book and thought, oh, well, that's really interesting. You know, what a blend of two interests of ours. So purchased it to then review with you, timed well with your birthday. And I have to say, I thought it was fun to go through, but no, I hadn't done that before, but I think it's something that I would consider doing again.
Yeah, so I'm kind of a nerd. So whenever I go to any sort of exhibit or show, I usually try to pick up something, or at least I did in the past. I've kind of grown out of it now because I just have way too many books and pamphlets and things. But I remember going to an art exhibit of Stanley Spencer's work, who was an English painter when I lived in England. And of course, I bought the little book that went with the exhibition and all of that stuff. So yeah, I was in my younger years, I was apt to buy a little piece as a memento. Too many of them, I fear, sit on my shelf now unread. But yeah, that's me. How about you, Emily?
They are some of my favorite souvenirs. So being a museum person myself, at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and I love going to museums, that they're my favorite thing to get, especially if the museum exhibit is not permanent. So I'm fortunate with the National Archives. I know that they digitize everything when they do the O'Brien Gallery is the exhibit that turns over about every 1 or 2 years. And I know that they digitize everything and make an online curation. So I don't always buy their book unless it's a exhibit I particularly loved. Like I have their 1970s America. Oh goodness, the name's escaping me, but they did all these photographs from the 1970s of the United States, just from around the country. And I really love that. So I have that book. But they put those online, but not every museum does that. So I like to get the book so that I have it to go back to. Permanent exhibits, you can always revisit. Most of that stuff you can find online, but stuff that turns over a lot. So I really enjoy these kinds of books. One of my earliest ones was from visiting the Newport Mansions in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, and they don't let you take pictures sometimes in these places. So I love getting the book because then I feel like I have the pictures or I have the history and the memories without having to take them myself. And of course, they're often way better than any picture I could take. So I'm a big fan of these kinds of books, and it's really fun to revisit sometimes museum exhibits after you've seen them. If you get to see them yourself, it kind of helps bring back what you thought and gives you more time to ponder it. So I like the additional opportunity to think about what I learned and what I saw.
Yeah, as we said, though, this is such a unique experience for us because never seeing this exhibit in person ourselves, how do you think the book did presenting the artifacts and the story that the curators were trying to tell through that exhibit?
I thought they did a fantastic job, honestly. I really enjoyed this book. I really liked the way that it was put together. I think we'll talk about this hopefully a little bit later as well, but it seemed to me to be a really nice juxtaposition of both Walt Disney and Dalí. Oftentimes it would be, a page of Walt and then the parallel page of Dalí, and showing either similarities or differences, through lines where you could really connect them as artists. And I almost felt like, wow, I did feel that sense of longing that I wish I had seen it live, but that, wow, this was obviously a great exhibit. And I feel like I got a little piece of it by reading this book.
Same. I use museum exhibits, books, or actually online virtual exhibits a lot in my classroom, and they're not always as cohesive or coherent to go through. I thought this book did a great job of making that comparison very clear. Their thesis was very clear of what the message they wanted to give on their audience, which was, even though these are two artists and innovators that you normally would think of being together as friends, as collaborators, they very much were, and it makes sense. So they had a very clear through line, and I felt that immediately as I was looking through the artifacts. So I thought it was very comprehensive, a good mix of mediums too. Like, while there's a lot of there's newspaper articles, there's photographs, there's sketches, there's artwork itself, the letters that they wrote each other. And I thought it was a good mix of mediums. It wasn't very just block heavy of here's all the newspaper articles, then here's all of the photographs, etc. So I like to think that this was the way it was laid out. I'm going to assume that it was because it just made so much sense to me. It was told like a story.
Yeah, I would assume a lot of the text was used within the museum, when you have the placards next to artifacts. But I appreciated it having it as a book. I think this is just my own fault. I sometimes read very quickly, or, there's so much to see in a museum, so maybe you don't get to spend as much time as you liked in that experience, or there's other people crowding around trying to read, so you don't get to see everything. So I felt I was able to take this much more slowly and really digest each piece. So I appreciated, having more time to spend with those artifacts and to do so at my own pace.
Why I like buying these. It gives you that extra time to really take it in, because I'm the same way in museums. I get caught up in the kinetic energy, or the videos and the audio kind of occupy your space a little bit more than wanting to sit there and read a newspaper article that's below a glass case and is really small print that you can't get any closer to. So having it in book form, I think I read more than I would have, like you said, if I was at the gallery itself.
It's kind of hard to unsee it now, having read the book and dived into Dalí and Disney and seeing their partnership. But why do you think people might find the friendship and collaboration between Disney and Dalí surprising? And did you used to find it surprising before you did your research?
I absolutely did. So I didn't realize that there was a collaboration between Disney and Dalí before the Gran Destino Tower was built in Walt Disney World Resort, which Courtney and Doug, you were the people who told me about it and were super excited. And you gave me the context and I was like, oh, they collaborated on something? Had no clue. So I was surprised. And I think some of that surprise comes from maybe not being familiar with what surrealism is. It's an art form that I think people recognize Dalí's work, the melting clocks, but they don't recognize what is surrealism. And it looks very non-Disney in art form, but actually, obviously now from our reading and from our exploration, we see just how much in common their art forms have. But also that idea that I saw throughout this, and also the accompanying documentary that goes with this museum exhibit and this book, is that there's a big difference between the popular art and the high art. So I feel like maybe you just get different audiences sometimes, that most people who are maybe big intakers of Disney maybe don't dabble as much in the higher, what is considered high art, or vice versa. Those who love high art spend a lot of time in art museums. You don't see as much Disney in those spaces. So seeing them come together, I think, can be a little surprising if you're not versed in both.
Yeah, I feel if Destino had happened as intended, there would be no question, this would be something that Disney fans were aware of. But as to why, I think going kind of off of what Emily said, like we contextualize people, I guess, within their broader fame and what we think of them. So to me, when I think of Dalí, I think of the persistence of memory painting from the 1930s. That's the one with the melting clocks. That's probably what people most associate him with. And photos of him with the mustache, or in the film Midnight in Paris, like of the 1920s, kind of this art nouveau, this new renaissance of the early 20th century. And I feel like we often think of Walt Disney as him later in his life, the Walt that we saw on television in shows like Disneyland or The Wonderful World of Color. And it made me think of this interesting historic comparison, kind of like one of those things that like bends your mind, where someone had shared that Martin Luther King Jr. and Anne Frank were born in the same year, and if they were still alive today would be the same age, but we think of them in two very different time periods of their life. So that kind of just goes back to what I was trying to share about like where we compartmentalize and contextualize famous people. So I was surprised as well going into the research itself. I was like, okay, I know that they did Destino. We've established that. But as to what Doug referred back to in the earlier question, just the parallels that were in this text and how really their lives mirrored each other in a lot of ways.
I was actually really surprised that these two artists collaborated. Just to give you a little background, I first learned of Dalí proper, about anything about his life beyond just looking at a piece of his artwork, when my friend was reading a biography of his during around the same time that Destino came out. So it must have been around 2003. And my friend told me the story from the biography that Dalí had built the love of his life, a castle. Gala was his muse and is in many, many, many of his art pieces, and also inspired some pieces that are in Destino. And she wasn't at the castle when she died, so Salvador Dalí couldn't drive, so he got the driver to drive them both to the castle so that his dead wife Gala could be put back in the castle. And I remember reading that the driver was hesitant to do this because Gala never sat in the back seat, but Dalí sat in the back seat. So just the how eccentric this was. I didn't really see him working with Disney, but to be honest, as I started to dive a little bit deeper and do the research, it made complete sense that they would see something in each other and want to get together to collaborate.
So even though most of us found this surprising, maybe initially, immediately when you start with this book, or if anyone listening did get the opportunity to see the exhibit at the Walt Disney Family Museum, you're immediately hit with just actually how similar Disney and Dali are, even though they grew up half a world apart in Spain and in California. And the whole book is laid out, like we said, in that juxtaposition where you go back and forth almost page by page to both Disney, then Dali. You also see their artwork side by side. So what were some similarities that you all picked up on going through this book form exhibit?
Yeah, for me, I found an immediate parallel between their family lives. It seemed that they both, sometimes struggled with overbearing fathers in their childhood and had a mother that doted on them. This also came through in another text we read that we had plugged at the end of our last episode, Captivating History. And I don't know that I would fully endorse that book. If you want to check the link to my Goodreads at the bottom, you can see my full thoughts and review on that text. But I saw that parallel in their biography of each of those in their separate chapters. And that came through within notes of their early chapters of this exhibit book as well.
Yeah, I saw a similarity, and I mean this in a positive way, if it can be taken in a positive way. I saw a similarity in their egos. The audacity to be as ambitious as they both were with their art, in their lives. I also saw a very clear similarity between the ways that they leaned on someone to achieve their artistic ends. So Dalí would be the first to admit that he was nothing without Gala. And I think that Walt Disney, as you two have discussed often on this show, would have been nothing without his brother. And so I find that those stories very poignant, and I saw the similarity there. How about you, Emily?
So I saw those, particularly what you discussed, Courtney, how their background, their upbringing. Doug, that's a really interesting similarity that you found. I hadn't thought of that one, but that makes a lot of sense. Also remarking in general that to be this successful, there's a lot of people behind both Dalí, as we've learned, and we know Walt Disney. But something that I also picked up on was there's similar fascinations with technology. Both of them started in pencil sketches, but then we see Walt Disney, he evolves into theme parks. Dalí evolves into going into film and also doing sculpture in some ways. So they're both fascinated with not sticking to one particular medium to tell their stories. And they're both excited about the next big thing. And we see that happening side by side as Disney goes from drawing cartoon advertisements in Kansas City to Disneyland, Dalí doing his pencil sketches, and starting to explore surrealism, to his paintings, then to sculptures. I loved the harp with the barbed wire that he sent to Harpo Marx, and that story and that friendship that came from that. But what you know of Salvador Dalí is his paintings. But here's him using sculpture. We're going to talk about the World's Fair. That's a totally different medium than I think most people are familiar with Dalí. But neither Dalí or Disney shied away from doing something new. Like you said, that ambition, that driving motivation to take what they know and their passions and just continuously challenge themselves. So I saw that as well. And I think that's what brings them to being friends, is they have that admiration for each other and that respect. And they see that and they want to collaborate, even though we know it doesn't pan out as it probably should have.
I love that piece about Harpo Marx, Emily. And it was interesting to note that Dalí sent a letter back to Spain when he was visiting in California in the 30s. And he wrote two of the Hollywood surrealists were, to him, Harpo Marx and Walt Disney. And that's just fascinating to me. Actually, he wrote a script for the Marx Brothers, but it never came to fruition. So once again, it just shows Dalí's fascination with film.
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting that Emily mentioned the World's Fair. Not only did they both present at World's Fairs, but it was the New York World's Fair specifically, Dalí in the 1939 World's Fair and Disney in 1964, as we've discussed many times on this show. So how would you compare their presentations, and how do you think the experience influenced each of their art?
So for you many book fans out there, I love to use book darts to mark my pages because I don't really like writing in my books. And one of the pages I actually marked in the book that we read was that page that has the wonderful artwork of Dalí's installation, which was called Dream of Venus from the 1939 World's Fair. And what it really reminded me of when I looked at it and when I read about it was Raleigh Crump's designs for the Museum of the Weird, which, again, sadly never came to fruition in its entirety, but we see pieces of it in the Haunted Mansion today. And so I just, I thought that, first of all, I love the images. I wish I could go inside of it. This 1939 installation, it looks amazing. And, so as weird as it sounds, I actually did see similarities, again, between these two diverse artists.
Yeah, so this struck me because, Courtney, you and I love talking about the World's Fair. We are obsessed with the 1964 World's Fair. So I was really excited to see this. And I think this is another similarity between the two, that the World's Fair acted as, it's a playground, not just for the people attending, but also for Disney and Dali as artists and as innovators to do something new and see how people take to it. We know that from the 64 World's Fair with the many attractions that Walt Disney created. Thanks to the World's Fair, we get It's a Small World, which gives us the mechanisms for having a boat ride and having the Omnimover and the People Mover and all the things that grow out of it. And I think we see that with Dalí as well. This was a chance for him to go more 3D, so outside of painting, and to have more of that immersive space to bring people into surrealism. It's not just something you look at, it's something you're part of, and it's something you can immerse yourself in, and giving that physicality to it, I think, helps understand surrealism. I really wish they gave us more. It's only 2 images on page 83, and I would have liked, since this book doesn't go beyond when Destino does not come to fruition, so we don't get the 1964 World's Fair in this book, I would have liked to see them side by side to see if I picked up any more similarities. I'm drawing on prior knowledge of what we've talked about on this podcast and prior reading. But I think both of them got to use the World's Fair as a testing ground to try new things, reach new audiences that maybe would not have been to Disneyland for Walt Disney or have maybe experienced surreal art going to museums that feature that stuff. It's the 30s. People are not traveling as much. We don't have the highway system. So this is probably a new presentation to a whole brand new audience. So I think for both of them that this is a turning point, because then it's shortly after this that they start to meet up.
Yeah, I have to say my knowledge of World's Fairs is really concentrated on the 1964 World's Fair because of its significance to the Walt Disney Company. But my understanding and what I took from the text was that Dalí's booth in 1939 was very innovative in that it was an experience. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm gonna walk up and watch a demonstration of the telephone or something. Like, you were going through it and going on a journey. And I find it interesting that that predates Disney's 1964 by World's Fair by exactly 25 years, and is even ahead of something like Disneyland by 16 years, to have an amusement experience like that.
They even say in the book, his controversial pavilion, Dream of Venus, was a walk-through surrealist funhouse, a precursor to the environmental rides that Disney would later develop for Disneyland. So even the Walt Disney Family Museum credits Dalí as maybe being an inspiration to Disney himself. Maybe he read about it. I don't know if he went there himself. This doesn't say. But that these ideas and types of attractions were developed long before Walt Disney perfected them.
Absolutely, and it's sort of described in other texts as well as like a Dalí funhouse. And so for readers who can't see the image, at the front entrance, it was actually the ticket booth. It's sort of a piranha where two people could be popping out of the eyes and get selling you tickets into this funhouse of Dali's dreams and imagination. And then above that, there's a portrait of Venus and all sorts of, like we talked about before, Dalí motifs. And then as you walk through, same thing. And he did it all himself. And so it just fascinates me. I would love to see more images of it too, Emily. But another thing this book gave us were these wonderful letters between Walt Disney himself and Salvador Dalí, or sometimes Walt Disney and Gala. So what did the letters between Disney and Dalí, both Gala or Salvador, reveal to you about their friendship and collaboration?
So first, I do want to credit the format of this book. This is the teacher in me, that, yes, we have scans of the original telegrams, the letters, both in English and in Spanish. But I do appreciate that they also retyped out a transcription, even though there is type off of a typewriter, and that they also translated everything from Spanish to English. So as a teacher and someone who has to create multiple copies and versions of things for students to read, I really appreciated how they did that in this book. Also, because if it was a smaller scan and maybe it was too small to read, they did have the translation, which was a more normal size text. So I geeked out a little bit in that part of the letter section. But overall, their correspondence is so intriguing to me because none of the letters are particularly long. And I think that makes you think maybe they weren't as friendly, but when you read them, they're very warm context, and they spend most of their time actually talking more about how is your family? We went to see you. How are things in your life? And then they're like, oh, yes, and I'll be sending stuff along for Destino. Like, Destino is part of it, but it wasn't the main meat of all of their writings. They asked about each other, their visits, their travels. So you see that they knew each other as people and as friends. And we see that later on that they visit each other's homes. I love Dalí on the Lily Bell in Walt Disney's Carolwood Pacific Railroad in his backyard. He looks almost out of place, but also not at the same time. But they talk about that. So I think the letters show that this is not just a business transaction. This is not just we're two artists, we're going to collaborate, and business is business. They actually knew each other as people.
Yeah, what I took from it was a sense of mutual admiration. Like, they admired each other's work from afar before starting off this letter writing and this friendship. And I think, within that friendship is where the collaboration stemmed from, but it wasn't like, oh, I'm just writing to you for this business proposal. How about we work together? It was, Walt Disney was seeking an autograph of Salvador Dalí. He wanted him to autograph a copy of the autobiography that Dalí had written. So I liked that there was definitely a clear admiration between them.
Yeah, there's this joke, I believe it appears in the documentary, but that Walt and Dalí the only reason they got along is because neither could understand the other. But that letter, the letters show the opposite, right? Obviously, as Emily mentioned, it shows us some of the Spanish originals, and then it even says on one of the copies, I believe it says, like, here's a free English translation for you. like Walt would need that. But I'm sure he could have gotten someone to translate it for him. But it's nice to see that, no, they did have mutual admiration for each other. And, it's so lovely to see Gala take over, because I think the first letters are between Walt and Salvador, and then Gala takes over writing for Dalí, and they're just as friendly. And it seemed that he really had a real admiration for both of them, and it doesn't seem fake or phony when he writes that he would love to go see them again, in their home and such like that. So I was very pleased with the letters and really liked it.
Something I liked about this collaboration too is through the letters you can see how it happened so organically. Like you said, because it's mutual admiration. Like, I like to think both Walt Disney and Dalí were like giddy when they got that letter from each other. like Dalí, who we know quoted, "I just met the surrealists of America," and says Walt Disney. I like to think that when he got the request for an autograph, he's like, oh, he knows me. And same with Disney, that when he sends it back and continues the conversation, Disney's also like, oh, he knows me too. And it develops so organically that they're like, yeah, let's do something. And it happens slowly, which we're going to talk about, possibly led to the collaboration ultimately not coming to fruition during their lifetimes. But with that slower collaboration, that organic back and forth, that building of a relationship, we see that there's a lot more here than just, like I said, them wanting to, hey, pop culture, we want to put something out and we need to make money for both of our studios because we're struggling. It's actually about the art and about them as people, not about the product. It was about the journey for them. So the letters really showed that, and I liked seeing that build and that collaboration organically form. So thinking about that collaboration, as we've mentioned multiple times already, it doesn't come together during Disney and Dalí's lifetimes. It actually comes together afterwards. So before we talk about Destino, why do you think it falls apart? Why does it not become Destino while they're alive? Were they too similar? Do you think their differences emerged too much? Like, what do you think led to this?
I don't know that it's a personality related thing. I feel like Walt was a bit more hands off at this point in terms of the studio. You know, he's not actively drawing there next to Dalí. That pleasure went to the animator John Hench. For Walt, I do appreciate that even though it did fall apart, that wasn't like the end of their friendship. As we see later on in the letters, they continued to visit each other. But as to why, I think just contextually, my theory is it's around what was happening at the studio. You know, they're toward the end of World War II there. The package films have kept the studio afloat, but they're kind of moving out of vogue. I think this would have fit really well in Fantasia or a package film, but I feel like it went into development too long and then ultimately wasn't able to find a place within one of those. And that's why, you know, it's not like we saw it added to Fantasia 2000. When it does happen, it gets released on its own as a short. Doug, what are your theories?
So in my research, I learned that Dalí was actually paid almost $18,000 for his work on Destino by the company. And so, you know, with inflation, that works out to be about $240 some odd $1,000 today. So, you know, he was paid a pretty penny for this. And so one of the stories in the documentary goes that as Dalí continues to revise his storyboards and his stories for Destino, you know, based on his dreams. I mean, he's a surrealist artist who is trying to encompass his dreams through art. He becomes obsessed with baseball, and he changes some of what had already been established by him and John Hench to the figure of now the male character as a baseball player. And, you know, one of the stories, we don't know if it's 100% true, but one of the stories is one day Walt went down to see how things were going, and he saw all these, you know, sketches of baseball players, and he said, what the heck is this? Where's my love story about destiny? You know, $17,000 down the drain. And that was it. We don't know if that's true. But again, as I said earlier, and I mean it with all respect, these two artists had uber egos. And I think that at some point, because of John Hench's admiration for this artist and the ways that they were collaborating together and letting Dalí bring in idea after idea after idea, it became less and less a Disney animation and more and more an outlet for Dalí to experiment with his art. And that no longer became viable for Walt financially. And so that's sort of what I've done piecing together my research.
Same. So when I was originally reading, I'm trying to look at it now. There's a lot of newspaper clips from Pasadena newspapers, from different California newspapers. One of the first things I noticed possible friction was when they described Destino, and Dalí gives this beautiful, almost poetic, I can't find it at the moment, it's very small text, description of what Destino's story is, and then Walt Disney says, boy falls in love with girl, like very, I'm paraphrasing, but very short and sweet. And I think that originally, like reading this, I was like, ooh, maybe there's the linchpin. They start to have those creative differences. But again, as we saw with the letters, they have mutual admiration for each other's art, for each other's craft, and their methodology to approach that. So, and we saw that, like you said, Courtney, their friendship doesn't end. The documentary, I think, said it nicely that artists have a way of understanding each other through this artistic process and not letting that get personal. And they did it. They allowed their friendship to continue. So I don't think it was so much maybe as like newspapers were trying to sensationalize of like they just grew apart. They don't see eye to eye, even though there were moments maybe where they didn't. And I think, Doug, I agree with you that when it comes down to it, and Courtney as well, that Walt Disney, his scope of his company is huge. They are doing multiple things. We're coming up on creating Disneyland. They're doing multiple projects for the government and now trying to get back into film. Disney is also a businessman, whereas Dalí, I don't think is. I don't see Dalí as merging art with business. Dalí is art for art's sake, and for wanting to reach like-minded people, whereas Disney has a little bit more of that business sense of, I do need to make a profit and produce product to continue my company, as well as creating art and reaching as many people as I can through that art. But I think that business sense, that eventually it came down to it, like you said, Doug, that he can't continue to put money into a process without a product at the end. The company can't do it because at the end they do have a lot more people to pay. They have rent for all their buildings, whereas Dalí doesn't really have those constraints. So I think some of just the practicalities of their work and their work environments, maybe that was the difference. Not them as people as differences, but just the environments that they work and live in.
Yeah, and perhaps, Emily, that's why I made the comparison between Gala and Salvador and Walt and Roy, his brother, because from all I've read, Salvador Dalí was nothing financially without Gala. She did all of his books. She did all of his finances. She negotiated all of his pay. So it's a little bit of like what we read about Roy and Walt, right? Roy was the business person who dealt with the finances, and Walt was the artist and ideas man. So that's probably one of the reasons why I saw similarities there.
So we wouldn't go beyond some of these similarities. The big theme that I immediately got out of this book was posing that deeper question about Walt Disney and Dalí as surrealists. So I want to go a little bit just to give us some grounding and some context. This is, again, very brief. I do not claim to be a expert in surrealism. So I'd like to credit New York's MoMA as well as the Art Story for giving some context here on surrealism. So it is led by poet Andre Breton. Surrealism is an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement. So we're focusing on art, but it is an overall movement across multiple mediums from 1924 through World War II. And surrealists were fascinated by the unconscious mind and the overturn of rational thought. Breton says surrealism is, quote, psychic automatism in its purest state, by which one proposes to express the actual functioning of thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern, end quote. And to continue, he also explains that surrealism is, quote, completely against the tide in a violent reaction against the impoverishment and sterility of thought processes that resulted from centuries of rationalism. We turned toward the marvelous and advocated it unconditionally, end quote. So overall, this movement is influenced also by new psychoanalyst psychology as brought on by Sigmund Freud. He was fascinated with tapping into the subconscious, analyzing dreams. And surrealists thought about using the rational mind was what was suppressing imagination. So they want to unlock that. They also have their movement inspired by Karl Marx, in that unlocking that psyche could also help reveal contradictions in the world to create a bigger dialogue, possibly even spark some type of revolution and new ways of thinking. So questioning the world around us through art, through surrealism, through unlocking the conscious. In some ways, surrealism is compared to romanticism in that sense, but surrealism looks to find revelations in everyday life for every person, tapping into the public. Anyone can experience this or have these ideas. So a theme and a question that comes up a lot in the book that I want to post here is animation surrealism?
I am still struggling with this question. Maybe it's because I'm not an art student. I mean, not that any of us were art students, but for me, I feel like they're two different art forms. And I'm not saying like, oh, they're just cartoons. Like, I think animation is an art form, and I believe certainly there are maybe surrealist elements to it. We'll maybe get to where we see that at play in Disney work, but to me, they're different. Where do you guys fall?
It is an interesting question, and one that I'm continuing to contemplate as you are, Courtney. I think that this might sound like a hokey answer, but to me, it seems like one of the things that Walt was able to do was inspire his artists to make dreams come true. And in a way, based on what I've read about Salvador Dali, that's really what Dali was good at, making dreams viewable and, able to be experienced by the masses through his art. And so in that way, I do see the things that, the Walt Disney Company, the things that they were able to create as surrealist. And the book does a great job of showing juxtaposed photos of, here's a piece that Ub worked on with Walt in the Silly Symphonies, and here's a canvas oil painting by Dalí, and you see you see the exact similarities. Studying film, you start to understand that one of the things that Luis Buñuel was able to do with Dalí was figure out how to translate that surrealist art into an edible cinematic format, so that it's not just image transitioning to another image, transitioning to another image, transitioning to another image, that you actually have a cinematic narrative remain surrealist, which was not easy to do. And so I think that, in some ways, Walt was very inspired by that. And that's why we get some of the more abstract avant-garde pieces from Walt Disney through Silly Symphonies up through Fantasia. And so, maybe I'm being a little bit too forgiving here in the book's ability to draw the parallels. But yeah, I do see some parallels.
I think it's really clear, at least from the museum's perspective, from the exhibit that's curated here from both the Walt Disney Family Museum and the Dalí Foundation, that they are arguing that Walt Disney's animation and these works from the Disney Company are works of surrealism. And having the juxtaposition helped me see that. I think what's harder to see is maybe being children of the Renaissance Disney period, that it's a little different, maybe with the exception of Beauty and the Beast with, more inanimate objects coming to life. But I do see it a little bit more clearly, like you said, through the Silly Symphonies. They had a lot of artwork from this. The documentary was also great at showing the clips from the film. So not just looking at the sketches, but showing how, like in Snow White, when she's running through the forest, when she's scared, the trees are arms and alligators are the logs in the water. And that was very surrealist. One of my favorite Mickey shorts, Through the Looking Glass, that pulls on Alice in Wonderland. To me, that felt very surreal. And when Disney used the silly symphonies, inanimate objects or nature being anthropomorphized to everyday things, I see the surrealism there. But I think it is portrayed very differently than Dalí. I don't know if Disney necessarily aims at the idea of the subconscious. I think Disney leans in the idea of imagination. Whereas Dalí, I think's motivation is more to provoke thought, and maybe, again, going off of these definitions and from Andre Breton's descriptions of surrealism, that idea to provoke maybe revolution or changing of thought, whereas Disney was more about, again, that imagination and entertainment, maybe some nostalgia. So I think surrealism, but they use surrealism very differently with different aims.
So Emily, when you're saying Disney there, I take it that you're referring to Disney as in the Disney Animation Studios, but I'd like to pose the question, is Walt Disney himself a surrealist?
It's a shame we don't have him to ask. I think if you had asked him, he would have said no. But I'm more interested in what Dalí said. And Dalí said that he was. And when Andre Breton and Dalí fell out, and Breton tried to throw Dalí out of the surrealist movement, Dalí said, "It's okay, I am surrealism." So if we're gonna answer that question, and you take Dalí at his word, and I do, then yes, Walt Disney was a surrealist. What about you, Emily?
Again, I think with going with the raw definitions we have here from Andre Breton's words, I would say 50-50. Again, using that surrealism to unlock the imagination, to reach everyday people through everyday life, anthropomorphizing the environment around us, or using things people know. It's not far reaching, and Disney is about the common, I don't want to say common, as I don't like that word, but like the common man. He goes back to his Midwestern roots. He's very grounded in talking with his guests. So in that sense, I do see the surrealism. Let me challenge your imagination in new ways of thinking, in changing your environment or how you view art, changing how you view animation, and bringing that to an everyday person, to a theme park goer, etc. But again, I think the motivations are different. Whereas maybe Dalí is trying to show like those contradictions in life to get you to be more thought-provoking of your environment. Disney wants to offer, I think, a more creative or imaginative release for entertainment, to make you laugh. Maybe to also, we know there are some very emotional moments in Disney films, to tap into that emotion, but not necessarily to change your outlook on something, but just to give you feeling. So again, I think through some of this lens, I agree that he's a surrealist, but again, with different aims and motivations than Dalí and the surrealist movement.
Yeah, I think you two have made very good cases that the elements are there.
If Walt Disney is a surrealist, which of Disney's works would you consider the most surreal?
I think this is a little tough. I really think his most surreal work does come from the surrealist time period in the 30s and 40s. I'm going to argue maybe Fantasia. And I think Walt Disney Family Museum also argues Fantasia, as well as Silly Symphonies. But my knowledge, I know Fantasia more. I've only watched Silly Symphonies more occasionally. I really should watch more of them. But I see in Fantasia that idea of thinking of music differently, and which is what Destino does. How do we take this music and put a story to it? And we see in Fantasia that broomsticks are telling a story through Sorcerer's Apprentice. We see different animals and a mountain coming to life and raising the dead in Night in Bald Mountain. So I see the surrealism there of how you challenge that, something that you've maybe heard or thought of before. You've heard this music most likely at some point. Now do you hear it and see it differently? because of their interpretation and unlocking the imagination.
Yeah, Fantasia jumped out to me the most, I think, just because we already think of it as something that's so different, but for all of those great points that you made in its style. Another one that maybe the movie itself isn't surreal, but some elements of the animation felt surreal to me, would be pieces of Wonderland in Alice in Wonderland. I guess I'm thinking specifically of that bird that's like made of eyeglasses as she's lost in the forest. Just that image. It must be the eyes, but that image came to mind of all the weird creatures. Like there's a bird that's also a pencil, I believe, just blending those things that are familiar into a new unfamiliar creature feels somewhat surreal to me.
So I want to take some time to give some credit to Walt's collaborators, and specifically Ub Iwerks. And I think if we had spent some time looking at Ub's work, not just with Disney, but beyond Disney, when he left for a little bit to do some animation on his own, I think that you would see that Ub was a surrealist. And, it makes sense that Disney and Walt were very, very close when they were young and really established this technique together. So I think that if we went back and looked at any of Ub's stuff, we would start to see surrealist art throughout his work. And I think that he was also, revolutionary in the ways that he was able to put art together to create a narrative story through cinema. So, we give credit to Buñuel. Maybe we should give credit to Ub Iwerks as well. But one thing that you didn't mention was Dumbo's Pink Elephants on Parade. And I mean, come on, like it's a dream sequence with freaky, crazy elephants turning into other objects. I think it's very Dalí. I think that sequence is extremely Dalí.
All great options here. Well, while there are definitely those elements between them, what has really brought us to this podcast and kind of the crux, I guess, of that exhibit was the short Destino. This is available to view on Disney Plus. It's about 7 minutes long. So if you haven't seen it, we highly recommend maybe pausing, taking a look at that, coming back here. And we're picking up with, do you all remember the first time that you saw Destino? Obviously, if you're the listener, this might have been your first time. But for us, do you remember, and what were your first impressions?
So I want to say it was around the time that my friend told me about that, and I really think I don't know for certain. The mind plays tricks on you, as Dalí would admit. But I want to say it was around 2003, so just about when it came out. My friend was reading the biography. He told me this crazy story about this artist who drove his dead wife to a castle, and somehow I must have gotten a hold of it. I was obsessed with watching anything that got nominated for an Oscar, and Destino did get nominated for Best Animated Short. So I think I somehow got a hold of it and was able to watch it. I will admit, I did not understand it at all. So my first impression, I will hopefully get a little deeper than that as we continue to talk. But my first impression was, what is this? Emily, how about you?
Completely the same. I was lost. But the first time I saw it was when I stayed at Gran Destino Tower this past year, caught up with both of you there. And while we were waiting to check in, it was playing on a monitor in the lobby. So while I was standing in line to check in, I watched Destino for the first time. And I remember loving the color. I loved the color scheme. And just the transition between those different images, like we've discussed, and Doug, you brought up how Dalí had to rely on filmmakers like Buñuel, but also John Hench on how do you take the images in his head and transition them from one to the other. And I loved the transitions, how she's in one dress and now she's in another, but now she's a ballerina with a dandelion head, but now we're going up a statue. You don't see what the statue is until she gets to the top. And I was fascinated by the transitions and the movement of the artwork, even though I had no idea the story it was trying to tell. It was mesmerizing to watch.
Yeah, in terms of my memories, this might be the persistence of my own memory. Doug, as you're saying, like, do we conflate these memories for ourselves? But I feel like I read an article about this in 2003 in Disney Magazine. Mind you, I was 11 at the time, but I was an avid reader of our quarterly Disney magazine that came to my dad's house. And I can't imagine that there was not an article, and I'm just making this up. This seems like something that magazine would have been all over, since it covered all aspects of the Disney company, not just the theme parks. But I don't believe I watched it until it was on Disney Plus. I feel like we watched it, you know, not like, oh, we're watching this and sitting it down and watching it for the podcast as we have done in the recent weeks, but like maybe a year or so ago, we're like, oh, this is on here. Let's check it out. Like you guys, I think I was like, I don't really get it. But I can say that my impression was that it was unlike anything that I've seen before in terms of animation. You know, it could fit in something like Fantasia perhaps, but also I don't know that it could. Maybe I'm contradicting myself here, but it's so distinct in its style, incorporating those very familiar motifs and threads used throughout Salvador Dali's artwork. Like, it is distinctly Dalí to me.
Yeah, I actually noted in the book, which something that was cool, I guess this leads us into our next discussion, but in the book you get to see some of the stills and the storyboard, and getting a little bit of that time. Like I was saying before, what's great about museum books is getting to sit with those artifacts without getting pushed out of the way or feeling like you have a time crunch. Getting to see, I actually bookmarked, what page was it? I have the bookmark somewhere. Page 166 and 167. It's the two heads on the turtles that converge, and then there's a silhouette between them of the ballerina. I didn't recognize that at first, but I looked at those two heads and I'm like, I remember those. Maybe I didn't connect right away that it was Dalí specifically, but like I remember seeing in maybe a high school or middle school art class those heads and the melting clocks. Like, those are very Dalí things that even if you're not familiar with Dalí, I was like, yes, that's Salvador Dalí. So I know what you're talking about. Like, I saw those motifs. So those stood out to me too, even though I, again, had no idea what kind of story it was trying to portray at the time.
Yeah, so thinking about the book a little bit deeper, how did the sources provided by that book and the museum change how you watched Destino? I know it definitely changed how I watched it, but how did it change how you viewed it?
Yeah, I appreciate, again, that time to sit with the storyboards and the artwork to look for all of the symbolism and all of the things in the work that Dalí created. I love how they were able to incorporate in the final Destino that they made in 2000s, that they had so much original art in there, because thank you to Walt Disney Company that you save stuff. You have the morgue. But getting to actually sit and look at, part of surrealism is you see like a far away picture, but when you look closer, it's made up of lots of different things. So getting to see all of the different symbolism and all of the little pieces that make up the sculpture, the overall artwork, getting to see that it's baguettes on the heads of the bicyclists and not just a hat, getting to sit with it, I kind of saw some of those things better. But also the newspaper articles stood out to me the most as being the most helpful, at least in the book, of giving me clues to the storyline, that it's about two people trying to get to each other and all of the things they have to work through first. So having that background was helpful the first time I watched it after reading the book, but then I also got more out of the documentary, hearing from the director, hearing from John Hench, ultimately what the storyline was and some of the meaning behind the symbols, which the book doesn't give as much meaning behind the symbols in the background, but the documentary did. So that helped me understand that storyline a lot better.
I too got a deeper appreciation from both of them. I feel that I didn't understand before reading really how far along this was. I think my initial understanding of it was that, like Dalí came and did some sketches, but it never really took off the ground. But it was fully storyboarded by John Hench and Dalí. It just never got animated. So I really appreciated in the documentary hearing one of the lead animators say, like, he literally retraced Dalí's storyboards to put himself into his mind frame to bring this to completion.
Yeah, and I just gained so much from reading the book that we all read to diving in even deeper into more research, and then wanting to watch things that I hadn't seen or hadn't seen in years. So my confusion was completely washed away, and so I would invite all the listeners to fully enjoy Destino. I think you do have to do a little bit of a deep dive into Dalí and his art and his motifs to truly understand what he's trying to do with this, and the ways that Roy E. Disney and the collaborators were able to bring, his collaboration with John Hench all the way up to 2003 and share this unique piece of art with us. I think that I would highly recommend going back and watching, and this is on YouTube. You can find it easily. His first collaboration with Buñuel, Un Chien Andalou, seeing again his obsession with eyes and his obsession with ants, and both of those come back in Destino. And definitely check out Spellbound by Alfred Hitchcock if you haven't seen it. The dream sequence, completely designed by Dalí, is stunning, and will give you some clues as to what he was trying to do in Destino. Because an interesting fact is the only scene cut from the dream sequence in Spellbound was he had envisioned that Ingrid Bergman's character would be encased as a statue, and the statue would break away, and she would come out of it as a free form. And that idea he wasn't able to pull that off in Spellbound, and it was never filmed, or it was never filmed in its entirety, and the scene was cut from the film. So when he gets to Disney, he reimagines that as the male character who is now encased as a statue and breaks from his form. So there's as I said, there's ants in Destino and they become bicycles with the baguettes on their head. I think it's fascinating, though, how some of the Disney animators, and I guess this is understandable because a lot of time had passed, they just get certain things wrong. Dalí had drawn cyclists before with rocks on their head as a metaphor, and somehow the Disney animators were like, "Oh yeah, that's bread." And it's a funny piece in the documentary where they share that John Hench, it's like the only note that John Hench gave, right? He saw the film, he loved the film, and he was like, those were supposed to be rocks, but but good job. So yeah, I don't know. I can't speak enough about it. Now I'm obsessed and I love it. And I think it now I have an appreciation for it and all the symbolism and what it means. And it is so Salvador Dalí.
Going back to what you said about that anecdote of Walt Disney being confused by baseball, and Dalí even quotes in one of those newspaper articles that he says, "It is a sport of which I know nothing, but as an artist, I'm obsessed." And it does seem weird. Like when you hear Walt Disney say, like, what the heck does this have to do with baseball? But then you watch Destino and somehow it makes sense. So when you see it through Dalí's eyes, you get to know Dalí a little bit more and understanding that symbolism, why he has an obsession with clocks and time, getting through obstacles for these two people to find each other. When the baseball part came up, it's very brief. It's not very long. I think maybe Walt thought it was going to be all baseball, and that's not where he was going. It made sense, or at least it fit that even if you're still pondering like why baseball, the movement with the music and the transitions made sense to me.
Well, one thing that I should probably mention real quick is that Destino went through many iterations, and it was going to be different things. And at one point, it was going to be live action mixed with animation. And so Dalí actually wrote a treatment script where he was going to be in it. and that full script is available in one of the books that I was able to read. And it's just fascinating, and it does make you have a little bit of FOMO, where you're like, oh, we missed out on this wonderful thing where we could have seen, Dalí actually in the picture, because he was going to describe his idea of surrealism and what it meant, and then it was going to transition into the animation. Of course, that never came to fruition, but I think what Roy was able to pull off with his team is pretty special, and I'm glad we have it.
And I think that ultimate culmination of creating Destino, as the museum argues, but also the documentary for sure, was to do this for Dalí and for Disney for art's sake, not as a product that Disney was going to push as a mainstream thing in theaters, is very much, I think, a good commemoration of Dalí and Disney's friendship and their admiration for each other, that they did this because they love art, because they love telling stories. And Disney and the Dalí Foundation came back together. Sorry, the Walt Disney Company and the Dalí Foundations came back together decades later to do this out of the spirit of art and out of the spirit of telling stories. So let's conclude our discussion of Disney and Dalí with Gran Destino Tower at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort. This is what maybe listeners who were like me were informed that Disney and Dalí had a friendship and collaboration relationship, because without this resort, I wouldn't have known that. So going to the resort, both of you have been. I've stayed there once. Where do you see Destino's influence within the resort?
Yeah, I'm happy to share that Doug and I recently enjoyed a stay there, which is why this episode was so many months in the making. We had made the resort reservation back in March. We had to actually stay there to be informed for this episode, so a bit of why it's coming to you so late in the month, but we appreciate and hope you find that it was worth the wait. For me in the visit, if you head to our Instagram, I had shared some photos that I took in the lobby area. In particular, I find that there's little Easter eggs in the art, and the one that I put as our featured image is one as you're transitioning to the main Coronado Springs building. There's an image of a dandelion with, I guess, would you call them like dandelion seeds or like wisps floating off into the breeze? And it's a fun touch because that motif of the dandelion seed shape is in Destino, the short film, but I like that they made this painting a not so hidden Mickey and kind of put two dandelions above the larger one to give it that classic Mickey silhouette shape to marry the idea of Disney and this short. I will turn it over to Doug, though, to talk about the Dahlia Lounge, because I'm sure you have lots to say there.
Well, I just think we had a great time, and over the years, I've told people that my favorite resort is the Contemporary because of the history and just the simple fact that I just love being there. There's something about being there, its proximity to the park, Magic Kingdom in particular, maybe the monorail. I just love the Contemporary. But, I'll remind Courtney now, like when people ask me, you got to remember Gran Destino Tower because it's really up there, if not the top. There's these little touches, as Courtney already mentioned, but then when you get all the way to the tippy top, there's a lounge, which is opposite the restaurant. And the lounge is completely devoted to Dalí and Disney's friendship and collaborative efforts. And so there's a running loop of Destino playing at the bar. It's just a beautiful lounge, and because we were staying there, we said, well, we better try all these wonderful treats. So we did, and we tried just about all of the light bites and all the different snacks that you can get, and they were all fantastic. And I don't have enough good stuff to say about Destino Tower. It's just one of my favorites, and you do get a sense that the Imagineers really put a lot of effort into, what Roy E. Disney was trying to do, which was to try to bring some of that history back. That there was once this wonderful friendship and collaboration between two unlikely artists. And I think you feel it when you walk into that resort, and definitely when you get to the top lounge.
I think it's interesting that I think with resorts, we're so caught up with theming, particularly with Disney. We're looking for those high themed environments that I think it might surprise some listeners or people who go for the first time expecting to see Dalí, that you don't see melting clocks everywhere or ants. The influence from Destino into the resort is a lot more subtle, and it does come across once you've seen the short. You have to see the art to see it in the resort's art. And I think I see it a lot with the texture. So I spent most of my time in the hotel room and also in the lobby areas and in the restaurants. I see a lot of texture, which when you watch Destino, there's texture everywhere. You have marble, you have wood, you have metals, you have organic textures like the dandelion and the flowers in nature. And you see a lot of different textures in Gran Destino Tower, especially looking at the lobby. You have all those different shape configurations with you have smooth marble that has then these very ornate chandeliers, but then also the columns are not like your standard like Corinthian columns. They have a lot of shape to them. They're octagonal and there's just a lot of texture that comes together. So in that way, I see Destino. I also see that concept of just being artistic, that Destino Tower, again, is not a overly themed environment. I know we're going to maybe think of luxury hotels like Grand Floridian. Grand Floridian is still, it's a elevated hotel experience and atmosphere, but it is still very heavily themed to Victorian style. But I think you still get this elevated theme in Gran Destino Tower that's not overly being, I hope we get what I'm saying here with being overly themed, like what you think of Disney theming. You're not getting Art of Animation or Polynesian Resort when you walk into Gran Destino Tower, but you're getting this sense of almost a very refined resort. And that kind of reminds me of the high art form that Disney also cares about, that Disney also puts into its pictures and into its own art, that it is also a higher art form. I hope that makes sense. It's very abstract.
No, much like surrealism itself. I get what you're saying. I think there is a grandeur to the lobby. Gran. There's a grandeur to the lobby in a different way than maybe Wilderness Lodge or the Grand Floridian, but it does still have that wow factor in the color, the way that it uses light, and as you've been saying, texture. I mean, okay, this is the all views are my own, do not represent the Walt Disney Company thing here, but a few months after the opening of Gran Destino Tower, Disney's Riviera Resort opened, and I have to say I'm very underwhelmed by that lobby. Like, that, no shade to Hyatt or another major hotel chain, but it feels like you're walking into a Hilton. You're like, this is a hotel lobby, whereas Gran Destino Tower does, I don't know, for lack of a better word, it feels grand to me.
Yeah, I'm curious, Courtney. What are some of your takes on the lounge? Because I just find it beautiful, and I think that we both enjoyed the food and drinks. But was there anything in particular that you thought was, particularly, but beyond the short playing in front of us?
Yes, we were right in front of the short at the bar on a good loop. That'll be the next Instagram picture. I have to say, I probably should have touched on this when we were talking about their friendship earlier. That is really where I learned about their friendship, not on this recent stay, because we wanted a good excuse to stay at the resort and to refresh our memory. But Doug and I did stay at the resort shortly after its opening, toward the end of August 2019, and we made our way up to the lounge, and I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot of photos of Salvador Dalí and Walt Disney. I had no idea there were so many photos of them together, and there are many of which were found in the Disney and Dali Architects of the Imagination book that was the backbone of this discussion. But there's them in Walt's backyard with the train. They're on a boat in what I believe is Spain. I did not mean to rhyme there. But really, I like that display. It was hard for me to get a good picture of that. Just the way the lighting is in there, I couldn't get it without a glare and a reflection of the exit sign. So we'll get to my resources in a bit, but that might be tip in my hand is one of them. But yeah, I just appreciate that, as you alluded to, the short is playing on TV. Mind you, there are two TVs at either end of the bar, and one of the opposite end of where we were sitting was showing, like, whatever sports game was playing that evening. But I was so glad we were seated in front of the one that was playing Destino on a loop. Like, how great that, TV in a bar is prime real estate, but they're like, we're gonna devote one of them to playing this short because that is what this bar is designed after.
And we'd be amiss if we didn't mention they have this glorious, I don't even know when it's from. I bet we could find it if we search hard enough, but they have this glorious Dalí cookbook that is sitting at the end of the bar that the server was kind enough to share with us. And so it's recipes inspired by Dalí and yeah, so just it's a lot of little touches, as Emily said, but they're all there. And yeah, I really can't recommend that enough, that resort.
I think we've talked a lot about, the construction of this resort, right? What makes it up, but do you see surrealism as a foundational element of its design if we want to go a little deeper there?
I'm not sure that I do, but I would love to go back.
Another excuse.
Yeah, it's another excuse to go back and do a deeper dive and see if I can pick out anything now that I've done some more research. Yeah, it's tough. My favorite piece by Dalí is the what is it called? Oh, I cannot remember the name of it. Something about the dream caused by a flight of a bee around a pomegranate a second before waking up, and it's a fish jumping out of a pomegranate with two tigers jumping out of the fish's mouth with a bayonet about to stab Gala, a nude portrait of Gala laying on a slab, and then in the background you have the elephant with the really, really, really long, skinny legs, and that to me is surrealism. that to me is a Dalí dream, and I don't get that sense beyond watching Destino in the lobby and in the bar. I get a lot of really intricate nods to Walt Disney's connection with Salvador Dalí, but I don't feel the surrealism that, say, you can see in pictures of Dalí's museum in Spain, which he was actually alive to help consider and put together. So on the top of that museum, you see egg structures, and that's a surrealist building. I don't really get that sense in the Gran Destino, unfortunately.
I don't really either, especially surrealism in the Dalí sense, other than how we, like you said, we see those nods in those appropriate spaces, like in the lounge, playing the short Destino in multiple places in the resort. But maybe I'm going to try to make an argument here. Maybe, as I was arguing before, surrealism through the Disney lens, through the Walt Disney lens of surrealism, of just giving you a new experience to look through. So thinking about its placement, Disney's Coronado Springs. Coronado Springs has gone through quite a few changes over the years, but it has the themed pool. It has a very distinct theming of Southwestern or South American. Had the Three Caballeros featured for a while. And I think Destino gives us a different look on similar culture, having those colors, those spices, that Spanish influence in a different way than we get in the rest of Coronado Springs. So maybe surrealism in that fact that we're going to change your perspective, that Gran Destino, even though it is not the Three Caballeros themed or the Southwestern or heavily South American influence of the rest of the resort, it's still a new take. I'm making a stretch here. But yeah, I don't see the surrealism, the Dalí surrealism so much, other than what we said, like with the color scheme and texture, which are elements of the art, but not necessarily the motifs and the motivations of what makes surrealism.
Yeah, they should have put melting clocks in the room as your
I think
your
there were
timepiece.
maybe some missed opportunities that I can get where surrealism is not everyone's preferred form of art. And it is resort. You need to have people to stay there. But I think there could have been some opportunities like a melting clock, some of those smaller motifs that are more well known from Dalí, that more people are aware of. I think they could have had some more elements there. The clock being the best example, like you said, that I could think of off the top of my head, but there could have been more.
I don't want to give any spoilers here, but in the dream sequence for Spellbound, there is, so spoiler alert, but I'm going to try to avoid the spoiler if I can. There is a Gregory Peck dreams that he is in a gambling establishment, and that there is a proprietor, a masked proprietor, an unknown proprietor. So he's masked; we can't see him. And then later, in a different Dalí painting, we see the proprietor again behind, on top of a roof, behind a triangle pillar, and he's holding a melting wheel. And he drops the melting wheel, and that melting wheel becomes symbolic of something that is very important in the film. I'm going to try to avoid the spoiler. And that's the kind of thing that I don't see, but I would venture to bet, knowing the Disney Imagineers, that it's there. You just have to know it and you have to find it. So I bet if we go back and inquire and ask and maybe even study a bit more, we could find those little nods where you think it's this, but it actually is symbolic of this. And I bet you it's there. I bet you they did it. I bet you it's subtle.
Just another good excuse to go back.
So speaking of going back, what do you like about this particular resort in general?
So while we just said, it doesn't really show surrealism, it's a fabulous resort. I loved my stay. I stayed for 2 nights after this was back in November of 2020. Stayed 2 nights over a weekend after spending time at a family timeshare. I tacked on a weekend at the resort. And what I loved about it was going back to the play on words, the grandeur of Gran Destino Tower. Again, I was not familiar with Dalí's work. I didn't get to the lounge, so seeing more of those more forward influences and connections to Dalí. But what I loved about the resort was feeling that grandeur of a luxury resort without being in a luxury resort, or luxury status resort, I should say. I think it is a luxury resort. It's beautiful in color. I took pictures of everything in that lobby, even though it's not surrealist, the artwork in the hallways. I loved the color and the light that is in that resort. The atmosphere of it is it's beautiful. And I absolutely loved staying there even just for the lobby. The hotel room, also great, but I could not get enough of the lobby and the common spaces and how they used color and light.
Yeah, I think what you said in terms of it feeling like a deluxe resort is really what hits home for me. I think in general, Disney's Coronado Springs is an underrated resort as a whole. That resort has 4 restaurants, four sit-down restaurants, like 6 bars, a lovely pool area with the iconic Mayan temple water feature. I remember seeing that in like advertisements as a kid, but we didn't stay there because it wasn't a Disney Vacation Club resort. So then when I got to stay there with Doug on my Disney college program, I was like, I finally get to go to this. But it was 32 degrees, so we couldn't go to the pool, but we have made it back there since to enjoy that pool. Great pool. So much to do there, but the tower itself is what I would recommend. When it comes to Disney resorts, there are different views. So there's like a water view, which would be overlooking the main area of the resort. You can maybe see the pool from up there. We had a standard view, which I will be transparent, is the cheapest view because it technically overlooks the parking lot. But if you're on a high enough floor, we could see Epcot and Disney's Hollywood Studios from our standard view room and heard the harmonious fireworks. All of a sudden I hear this big booming echo. I was like, what is that? I looked out my window and it's fireworks. It doesn't say it's a fireworks view, but that's such a surprise and delight. But the amenities itself feel deluxe, but at the moderate price point. I'm saying these, and of course, for any Disney theme park fans or those who might not know, those are the different tiers for the resorts. There's the value resorts, the moderate, the deluxe villa. So for me, it's a deluxe feel at a much appreciated moderate price point.
My room did have the Epcot and Animal Kingdom view. Beautiful. I stared out that window multiple times at night and during the day, just to see everything. And it overlooks like the lake, and the common spaces of the resort, like going towards the pool, and you have the restaurant that's on the pier in the middle of the lake. It was beautiful. Great view.
Okay, you're both making me want to stay now. My birthday's coming up, so it really is one of my favorites. Oh my goodness, it's just so glorious. Wow, you've said it all, really. I'll say this, which might be a little different. When I'm trying to stay on Disney property, one of my measures of success is, could I potentially stay at the resort and do nothing else? No parks, no, and that's not the ideal. Of course, I want to go to the parks. I want to enjoy the lovely parks, but could I potentially stay at the resort and do nothing else and enjoy myself? And I'll tell you what, this is the place to do it. Like Courtney said, there's so much to do. You could have a week vacation there and not get bored. I swear it. So that's what I love the most, is that there's so much to do there, and you could experience all the different, especially if you're a foodie, I think you got to go, because it really does have one of the best options for, I can eat here that one night, I can eat here the other night, I can eat here the other night. And don't make no mistake about it, the lounge is different than the restaurant next to it. So it's just got so much to offer, and that's my take on it.
I think we decided this might not be the most family-friendly part, but I think we decided, people drink around the world at Epcot. You could go on a 6-bar crawl just at Coronado Springs because of all that it has to offer. It has the benefit of being a convention space as well. But Doug, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said, when we're staying, you and I in particular, we are local to Orlando. So for us, it is a staycation, and we really are putting the emphasis on enjoying the resort when you and I stay at a Disney resort, and that really has been one of my favorites to stay at as well.
Well, I think we're all going to be booking a trip anytime soon, and listeners, if you haven't been convinced, just come talk to us, and we will convince you even more to stay at this resort. But I want to take us out of the resorts and kind of close out thinking again about surrealism. I know I'm racking our brains here and really challenging us, but we talked about, is Walt Disney a surrealist? Is animation surrealism? But are resorts and theme parks surreal? Do you think there's a specific attraction or part of a resort that we've all been to, any part of the Walt Disney World Resort property that you think fits surrealism?
I don't think a specific attraction comes to my mind, but I would say it's surreal in the fact that it's combating our ideas of reality. We often think of theme parks as a place for escapism, so maybe in that regard, it fits the definition.
I think that Heffalumps and Woozles owes in a large part its creation to Pink Elephants on Parade. So if you go through either or any rather of the Winnie the Pooh attractions and experience that, I think that is surrealism at play. That is surrealist art, when you can see other things in a sort of dream sequence that only Freud himself would analyze. That's when you have reached surrealist art. So when we those of us who are fans of Walt Disney World or Disneyland rather, go ride the Winnie the Pooh attractions and go through the Heffalump and Woozle scenes, and there you will find surrealism in the Disney park.
I agree that I think that's Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. That section is the most explicitly surreal. But I also agree with you, Courtney, that I think if we take that interpretation of surrealism, that it's about unlocking the imagination, it's about transporting you to something new or something different. I think we get the Disney version, or just thinking of what the word surreal means, past real. I think we could argue in some ways that like Main Street USA and Sunset Boulevard and Hollywood Boulevard of Disney's Hollywood Studios could be surreal in the fact that even though they are real places or based on real places, it's a idealized or imagined, dreamed version of those places. The Hollywood that never was but always will be, the nostalgia of Main Street USA, and I think just the active theme parks themselves of how they transport and try to get you to tap into emotions. And for Disney, nostalgia for particularly our generation, I think that can be surreal. Maybe not Dalí or the surrealism movement, but a more broad version of surreal.
Yeah, I think you've made a great case for ways to incorporate surrealism into our own lives or any upcoming Disney trips. As always, we like to close out with other resources for our listeners to enjoy. So if we haven't sold you enough, I would say visit the Gran Destino Tower. I know some people are very fond of their particular resort, so if it's not necessarily where you want to stay, I do think it is worth a visit. As we said before, there are many restaurants that you could get a reservation to enjoy great food and then take some time to check out the resort, walk around. It's gorgeous. If you don't have an upcoming trip planned, though, I wanted to recommend Lou Mangiela's WW Radio Show episode number 560. That was a Gran Destino Tower review shortly after the resort opened in 2019. So you can get another podcast perspective on the resort and all that's on offer there, and some great descriptions.
A resource I want to leave is one we mentioned quite a few times throughout the podcast, is a documentary. It's called Dalí and Disney, A Date with Destino, and was also written and directed by Ted Nicolau, who also helped curate the museum exhibit at the Walt Disney Family Museum. It's mentioned in the book, and Courtney and I were playing around like, oh, wouldn't it be so great to find it? And I was like, let me try YouTube. The entire documentary, 1 hour and 22-minute documentary, is available on YouTube. So we did link it in the show notes here if you're interested. What I really enjoyed about it was after reading Architects of the Imagination, it follows that museum exhibit. So it kind of brought it to life because while the book is beautifully laid out, tells a very clear narrative, we don't get the audio and some of the visual elements that they talked about in the museum exhibit's description. But the documentary does give us that, as well as some additional voices like John Hench, Roy E. Disney, the director of Destino who helped create the final product. So getting all of those different hands and voices in there really brought this museum book even further to life. So if you can't get your hands on the book, highly recommend watching the documentary. If you get your hands on both, read and watch in tandem, and you'll get a lot out of it.
Yeah, and to add on to that, Emily, I want to say that I was able to get a hold of the Dalí and Disney Destino, the story, artwork, and friendship behind the legendary film by David Bossert, who was actually a producer on the 2003 Destino. And for those of you who can't find the Disney and Dalí Architects of the Imagination, which is a really fantastic condensed read, and I would highly recommend that, go ahead and pick this up. It's still available. It'll give you everything you need and more. It's fantastic. It has Dalí's, as I said, original script treatment with his live action lines, along with the boy that he was supposed to play opposite. It has the original lyrics of the song, My Destiny of Love, which is the song that plays over top of the animation. And fun fact, that was actually written by Ray Gilbert. The American lyrics, the English lyrics were written by Ray Gilbert, who wrote Zippity Doodah. So the Oscar-winning song from Song of the South. So just fun facts there. And so I highly, highly recommend that book. And then for fans who want to take a deeper dive into the mind of a surrealist, I would recommend The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, which is his autobiography. Now, fair warning, this is not an autobiography in the truest sense. Salvador Dali has made up a lot of his backstory in this book. But what it does is it gives you a deep dive into his mind and how he came up with some of the art that he did. And then he wrote sort of a sequel of sorts called A Diary of a Genius, Salvador Dali. And that goes back to what I was speaking to earlier about his ego. So it'd be interesting what we would have had if Walt Disney himself had written a biography. But there you go. Those are my recommendations.
We always appreciate how well-read and prepared you come to the show. And next month, we'll actually be chatting with a friend of Doug's. We'll be joined by fellow University of Maryland alumni and current professor at the university, Dr. Paul Cody. You may have heard Paul on our podcast pal Brett's Notably Disney show, and we're excited to welcome him to Book of the Mouse Club for the holiday season. Paul will join us to discuss Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and will be sure to also compare this text to Disney's own adaptations featuring Mickey, the Muppets, and even Jim Carrey. You can find open source editions of the text online for free, and all 3 of those films are on Disney+. In the meantime, you can keep up with Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter and Instagram at Book of the Mouse. Email us with comments or ideas to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. And please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so others can find our podcast and read and listen along with us. You can keep up with me on Instagram at Great Gutsby or on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the same handle at Emily_McD. And Doug, where can our listeners connect with your work?
Well, thank you. I continue to write and publish. And as I believe I mentioned last time, I have pieces in the journal Senses of Cinema, another journal called Continuum, the peer-reviewed journal of African diaspora drama, theater, and performance, and Praxis, a writing center journal, among others.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing those in addition to your time with us today. As our guest of honor, you know the drill. We've asked you to close us out with a quote.
So this quote comes from one of the introductions, and there are 2 written by the authors for Disney and Dali, Architects of the Imagination, which is the book that we mostly discussed today. And the quote reads as follows: Disney and Dali prefigured the environmental impulses that today move art from the canvas out into the world. Amplifying their images in new media, they reach expanded audience through film and animation. They appropriated as works of art a newspaper, the installation of a museum, and the building of a theme park. They made tangible an imagined reality. Fanciful physical spaces infused with personality and a particular psychological disposition, which by the participatory power of physical space attach us emotionally to their visions.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for joining us today.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Book of the Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.